All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's e-Academy session, Simplifying Slate and PeopleSoft Campus Solutions. My name is Casey Hickman, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for attending. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. You are all on mute, so we can hear our speakers today without any background noise. Due to the number of people in attendance, we will take questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please ask your question at any time in the Q&A box found in your Zoom dashboard or through the chat. At the end of the presentation, you may raise your hand to unmute yourselves to ask a question as well. Tomorrow, the recording and slides of today's presentation will be made available on the HUG community for you to access. Now I'd like to pass the floor to today's presenters. Thank you all for joining us. Dan and Holger, the floor is now yours.
All right. I'll say good morning, but it's afternoon in some places and morning in others. So welcome, everybody. Glad to have everybody here. There's a lot of familiar names I see out there on the list. We're not sharing faces yet, but it's good to see everybody at one of these HUG gatherings. I'm sure everybody's excited about Phoenix. I am. It's good to be out there and see everybody again. So looking forward to it. Today, we're going to talk about simplifying Slate and PeopleSoft campus solutions, and basically just some of the connections and some things that we did along the way on our project and some various other clients that we can talk about, as well as Holger is going to dip into some awesome stuff related to student success. So for those of you that are not on student success yet, you might get a glimpse of some of the highlights there as well. And one moment, please. My name is Dan Moran. I've been doing campus solutions for a little over 20 years. I was introduced to Slate about 13 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that, 2010-ish. And I've been working in functional and technical roles, as well as some project management, which I don't like, and training along the way. I'm going to hand it off to Holger, who's a colleague of mine and also has become a friend because we spent many mornings together putting our integrations together. Go ahead, Holger.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Holger Tippel. I'm Chief Information Officer at UMass Dartmouth, and I've been at UMass Dartmouth for about 20 years now. I started with web application development and then took on roles with increasing responsibilities up to the current role.
And not to downplay Holger's role as CIO, since that's the top of the shelf, he literally is a hands-on CIO and led the entire Slate implementation for his school, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so I wanted to talk about some of the services that we offer with SpearMC. And so we have 6 different service lines. Some of them are proprietary products. You guys probably, some of you may have implemented PTF, the People Tools testing framework. We actually have some bolt-ons. You may have looked at it in the past and not implemented it for various reasons, but we have some bolt-ons to that to make it flow a little bit smoother. So that's something that you may want to take a look at. We have consulting services in all areas, not just campus solutions, managed services, as well as cloud services. So those of you that are interested in kind of the lift and shift, getting up to OCI, take a look at that as well. And then any of the emerging technology services, the new fun stuff that comes out, we always take a look at that and work with our clients to implement new pieces of functionality from Oracle. And then learning services, we'll talk about the training. So we've been really ramped up in training for people tools, financials, and HCM. And now we're really going to bolster our campus solutions training. So we have some classes over the last year. We have 3 to 4 classes coming up in the December and January timeframe, and we're going to keep rolling those out for you guys. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So our project was at the University of Massachusetts, and with that, we had 3 different schools. So it's a system with the president's office. That's Boston, Dartmouth, and Lowell. There's one shared instance of campus solutions. They've been on it for 20 years. So I think a lot of folks out there have been on campus solutions for a long time in this group as well. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the actual applications as we go through it. So as far as the admissions ecosystem, it isn't just Slate and it isn't just PeopleSoft. There's some other pieces in here at play. And it was a little bit more complex than what you would see at a single institution, but not as complex as some of the things that you would see in some of the major systems like a CUNY or CSU or VCCS or one of those. but we're fairly complex from that perspective. So as far as admissions from an undergraduate perspective, we're using Slate at all 3 of the schools. From a graduate perspective, this is one of the things unfortunately, I don't have the polling set up, but it would be interesting to see who are liaison schools out there. From that perspective, it was called admissions by liaison. Those of you familiar with it, they've kind of rebranded that to outcomes. And so we implemented outcomes or admissions by liaison prior to Slate being a product at the UMass system. So we already had that in and pushing through to admissions applications web services. So that was all web service based. The student success module currently is only at Dartmouth, thanks to Holger and his team putting that together. I imagine that the other schools are probably going to pick that up now that they've seen what he was capable of and putting that in. So it's pretty neat. We do use Salesforce to some extent as well. I know that they have a footprint in some of your schools. So, whether that be for the intake for the registrar's office, using Salesforce Service Cloud or EDA. I don't think that we've looked at EDC yet for Lowell in particular. And then also the Student Success Hub. So don't confuse that with Slate's Success Hub. That's actually the Salesforce version. As far as the CAS, again, the outcomes, we have a couple different pieces of that. Now, again, in this time frame, so we've implemented Slate in the last couple of years. CAS came up before that. And so in that process, CAS actually partnered with Technolutions, and they created an integration on their side, so that the actual CAS applications can flow into Slate and then into PeopleSoft if that happens to be your SIS, which many of you are using. We also use DocuSign, and this was kind of cool because if you're not familiar with DocuSign, just think of a PDF form like Adobe, where prospective students can fill out applications. We push them through into our system using the same admissions application web services that we set up for Liaison and Slate. So that was actually a super fast way to get them into the system using technology that we already had that's supported by Oracle. And Holger.
All right. When we're looking at Slate, some of you may have already implemented it. Some of them are considering it. There are several decisions you have to make from the business perspective. And the foremost decision is, when do you want to move applications to PeopleSoft? Are you moving it when they're matriculating? Are you moving it at an earlier stage? Do you even send prospects to PeopleSoft? In our case, for UMass, we made the decision that we are sending applications to PeopleSoft when they're completed. So that's still a few steps away from matriculation. Then also, what is the system of record for data at various points? When you're coming from PeopleSoft, from a traditional campus solutions implementation, PeopleSoft may be your record of a system of record for application records and for student records. Now, in our case, we made a conscientious decision to change the system of record at the applicant stage to become Slate. So now we have Slate as the system of record with all the operational data at the admission stages, and then we have PeopleSoft Campus Solution as the system of record at the student record stage. And then you also need to think about reporting. Do you want continuity in reporting? That means you need to make sure that your reporting streams are consistent, even when you change the system of records from Campus Solutions to Slate or any other system. In our case, one of the paradigms we set out with was that reporting cannot be disrupted. It needs to be continuous. We need to be able to compare year after year after year. And that's probably the case for a lot of higher ed institutions. Another important part when you sort of start out with the implementation is the documenting your admission processes. A lot of the processes probably exist in their own world, and they're just sort of handed down from staff to staff as you hire new staff and offboard existing staff. But is there really any formal workflow documentation? We went through an exercise, and not to the most granular level, but to a fairly decent detail, especially when it comes to integration, to document the business processes and data flow processes and how it handshakes with the surrounding ecosystem of applications. And we ended up with somewhere like 20 to 30 page Visio document that really illustrated it. It also gave us the opportunity to look at the processes critically and say, where can we do simplifications? And we had to look at multiple multiple admissions offices. So we had to look at it from the perspective, can we align the operations across multiple admissions offices? And then related to that, once you have your processes, you also need to inventory your third-party integrations and connection points. Next one then. So once you inventory your overall business environment around the admissions processes, the next thing is you need to look at Slate. And if you're just starting out with Slate, that may be a little bit difficult to do, but there are various ways to deploy Slate. In our case, we are a multi-campus institution. We share a campus solution instance among 3 campuses, Boston, Dartmouth, and Lowell. We also have on each campus multiple admissions offices. In our case, we have actually 5 different admissions offices. We have undergrad, graduate, we have continuing ed, we have the law school, and then we also have, not so fast, then you're ahead of the game.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We also,
all right. Oh, there you go.
Nope, not yet. One more. There we go. And we also have an alternate path admissions program. Then when you look at it from the ownership perspective, do you need to make sure you segregate your data, your records, or can you combine them all into one instance? It becomes even more important when you decide to go towards student success in Slate. Do you keep everything in one instance? Do you share an instance with admissions and student success? Or do you separate them out where you bring over the data to student success once they matriculate? So in our case, for Slate admissions, like I mentioned before, we decided on one instance shared with 5 admissions offices. So you can imagine this was quite some work. And so understanding all the processes and the variances in the processes across all these offices was really important, but we made it work. And then, of course, we had to worry about standardizing our integrations towards the shared campus solutions instance. Student success, we just started earlier this year. We went live in August. So student success, we decided to go with a separate instance just because the complexity was already there with 5 admissions offices in a student admissions instance, that we didn't want to add on top of it the complexities and the data differences and data models for student success. So we decided to go with a separate instance, or Technolution sometimes just calls it a separate database. Next one. So at an early stage, when we started planning out the Slate implementation, we just took a look out from a more centralized perspective. What are the integration points that need to shift? What is the data that comes into PeopleSoft and what comes out of PeopleSoft? And this view that you see here really is more the shared systems between Boston, Dartmouth, Lowell. It doesn't capture so much all the different individual campus systems that also connect to the ecosystem. So on the right, at the left-hand side, you see the incoming application sources. Dan already mentioned that we have Common App. We have the typical application intake sources, Common App transfer, Common App. We have ACES for the law school that's specific to the Dartmouth campus. At Boston, Lowell don't have a law school. And then we started looking at other sources with Slate in mind. We also built out the Slate internal application form. So we're not just relying on Common App, transfer Common App. And in our case, we do not use Liaison. We started implementing Liaison, but then the Slate project took over and the graduate admissions office decided to only use the Slate application for graduate studies. So we have that as an intake. And then there were some old what we call web apps that were custom built by our central IT department that fed directly into PeopleSoft and into the recruitment admissions module. So we had to also consider how do we transition those to Slate. And on the outbound side, we have some things like document imaging, where you have all the materials from Slate need to go there. We have Campus Logic for financial aid. And then we have the identity management environment. We are using OIM and OAM and OIM, and that pushes out to the campus Active Directories. And then we use OBIE as a reporting data warehouse. We call it Summit in-house. So what you see here, Summit is OBIE behind the scenes. And then we have various Salesforce instances like Dan mentioned. And in case of our campus, we're also using Salesforce Service Cloud, but we're really using it only for case management. We found that Slate doesn't have a functionality maybe yet to really do efficient case management, so we're sticking to Salesforce for that. So with all these integrations, we had to come up with a standardized approach to integrations. And in this environment for student admissions, we have the 3 Slate instances, 1 for each campus. We have central PeopleSoft campus solutions, and we decided to use Boomi as the integration broker. Now, on the Slate side, we are using export queries that put files out to SFTP. That's the recommended way from Technolutions to do this. They also offer web services, but web services have limitations how much you can run at certain times. So the standard way for Slate is just write out files and then have an integration broker pick up the files. We standardized all the integrations via Boomi, and then we'll go further details on how this actually played out for us.
Thanks, Holger. Yeah, I also wanted to add there, as far as the middleware, some schools, smaller schools probably that are on here, don't have a middleware package or can't afford a middleware package, and that's okay. You could be using various other options, whether it be shell scripts or PowerShell scripts or even app engines or SQRs to move the files back and forth from the SFTP servers. Some of our other clients have used Informatica and other tools as well. So from an EDL perspective, you'll see lots of various choices in there. This is just a snapshot at a moment during the project in terms of some of the integration deliverables that we used. And as you can see, this would apply to many of your schools. And it may not be the exact same items or the exact same names or vendors or what have you, but we're dealing with a lot of the same information that's going back and forth. From that perspective, campus logic might be used here. You could be using PowerFade somewhere else, or, SFP or something, whatever it might be that your individual school is using. We wanted to talk to Slate and PeopleSoft correctly in the right sequence and in the right orders. And, keeping that in order is very important as well. One of the cool things that I'll talk about further down the road here in a later slide will actually be how we did the academic advising as well and how we tied that in. So that was a little unique thing that we did for UMass. That's not a standard out of the box type of activity. As far as the export files and schedules, I think many of you, at least the Slate folks that are already live, are familiar with kind of those windows of time throughout the day and evening when you have that time to run the schedule. It doesn't always finish within that window, and sometimes it runs over, as we all know. So you have to strategically plan accordingly to make sure that you're picking up the files that works the best for your school. It also is a timeliness factor. In the situation for UMass in particular, we were, I would say, a near real time on the inbound side into PeopleSoft. So Boomi would pick up, the file and do any translations that we needed to do and feed that over to the admissions application's web services. And so from that perspective, once Boomi picked up the data, it was near real time. And then from there, we would process the PeopleSoft processes using web services to push through the transactions and capture all the necessary data that you guys are dealing with today, whether it be an employee ID or an application number from the onset, and then maybe some things that you're passing along after, whether it be biodemo information, could be enrollment information, matriculation information, whatever your school has chosen to pass back to the system. Could be your fan award letter. In our case, we had the AAR report going back as well. So that was visible within the Slate interface from that perspective. Again, this was very complex because it wasn't just one school. We had 3 different schools and a lot of different stakeholders involved in the decision making. But as far as the system was concerned, we only had the one instance of PeopleSoft Campus Solutions and many inputs and inbounds, as you've seen on some of the earlier slides. As far as the types of data, test scores, student groups, which is not delivered in the AAWS, you can tweak that through an entity group, service indicators, deposits, scholarships, and then everybody has some form of DI, it seems. And in many cases, you might be using Slate as your DI, or you might be using Slate and another tool as your DI, or you might just be using the other tool. And so how do you make those talk? Does it have to end up in PeopleSoft? Where does the indexing flow? You need to take all of those into consideration as well. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to load up the Q&A. We will address all your questions at the end, and we'll just go through them. So hopefully we'll be able to get clarity for you on those. From a typical Slate implementation standpoint, at least from the admissions side, you have your planning, your design, your configure, your test, deploying, and then typically you're going to have staggered releases and go lives. Of course, Technolutions will provide you the instance, and in theory, you can do all of the things that you want to do in Slate before passing off. What I've seen at various schools is some schools will do the decisioning in PeopleSoft or whatever the SIS is. And so sometimes we want to move it, as Holger mentioned, at the very end. The most processing, I think the best practice is to do as much processing as you can in Slate, so that you're moving it at the very end in terms of when it comes across to PeopleSoft. There's less to maintain from the 2 disparate systems, and keeping them in sync, as well as just having kind of a coordinated effort there for migrating the data to and from. There are a lot of different integrations, and you may see some familiar names up here for some of the third parties that you guys deal with, as well as different things that you've built inside of Campus Solutions, whether they be customizations or particular pieces of delivered functionality. So as you can see on the left-hand side, I just have a list. Some of the ones that are out there: StarRes, I think Holger mentioned ACES, Ancora. Salesforce may be involved in you may have a different CRM that you're using at your school that you have to interface with PeopleSoft and or Slate, or some mixture of that as well. And then the DI too. I think one of the most challenging areas here was the external education. So if you've had to tackle that, and I think I want to say a year or 2 ago, there was a change that came through, which was a little helpful from Oracle, which was great to provide an update to that package. But again, the external education is challenging just because of you're pulling information from various schools. You don't have control of how they're storing it, and some of the key fields are different. So that can provide a challenge, and you have to make decisions as to how you want to update that data as well and how you store it. As far as PeopleSoft customizations to simplify the integration, one of them was a test score mapping modification. So that was something that actually lives inside of PeopleSoft. And so when the data came from Slate, as you know, Slate is a blank slate and you can configure it however you want. So, the person in the chat that's sitting next to the next person in the chat may have very different looking applications, may have very different setup. And so, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can set it up. Test scores is one of those things that's provided. And so it's standard inside of Slate for various test scores. And then from that perspective, you may have set them up quite differently on the PeopleSoft side. And so in that case, it's helpful to have mapping. Effective dated customization. We put in a customization to update the effective date to be the date that it was posted. So those of you that are using the delivered processes, some folks don't even use, whether it be file parser or AAWS, don't use that. They have their own application process that was built many, many moons ago, and they didn't use the delivered pieces. They feed directly into those tables. When you hit the delivered tables, there's the effective date that you have to deal with. And so how do I do updates after the fact? You can't process updates in a downstream interface for a date that hasn't happened yet. So what I mean by that is, if you have a record in suspense, it's sitting there, the effective date's not there until it actually posts. you may have gotten biodemo updates, you may have gotten decision updates from Slate, whatever it might be. And if you're queuing those up, depending on how you're running your integration, they're not going to match up. So there's ways to either have those queued up or you can wait. It just depends. And then you have to deal with the sequencing. I think I mentioned that you can do entity updates. So on the PeopleSoft side, you can add, it's considered a customization, but it's fairly easy customization. It's one of the benefits of using AAWS or file parser for that matter. So when you have somebody out there that knows how to use file parser or knows how to use AAWS, they can kind of plug into your environment and figure out how to update it or change it or manipulate it for going forward. I mentioned the export for the academic advising report. We worked with Technolutions and they helped us out, which was super cool. It wasn't a big lift on their end, but we needed it in a timely manner, and Technolutions was great in helping us out. So we took everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of folks that implement Slate take the financial aid award letter from PeopleSoft and send it over to Slate. You do the thing where you update their ID, whether it be the application number or the Slate ref number at the top. We did something very similar and changed that for the AAR. So that's something that's not out of the box, but it was a kind of a similar activity, and it helped our folks because they wanted the advising report for data to be available. This is just a screenshot of the test score mapping to give you a reason why we did that. And there's a kind of a separation here. If you look at the ACT versus the AP, there's a test subtype for AP, whereas there is no test subtype for ACT. On the graduate side, I think GRE or GMAT, one of those has them as well. So it is useful depending on how you've configured your PeopleSoft test scores. We had a series of staging tables, and the reason that we did this, you can let integration broker in PeopleSoft kind of post everything, and then you're working with the IB logs and error handling and all that kind of stuff. We decided to post our own staging tables so that everything that came in or out was available. So we insert the web, from the web service, we insert into our staging tables the data. If we get an error, or if we change a status on something, we actually just go in and SQL update that table through the interface. So it's really nice from an API perspective to have a central location to see what's going on, especially when you're in the middle of testing pre-go live, and then just any downstream area. Our approach was we brought up one school, and then as that school was live, we were bringing up another school, maybe a month or so later, and then we brought up another school. So we had the ability to kind of stretch a little bit in there, but not so much because everybody was transacting on the same tables. With these staging tables, it was super helpful to be able to troubleshoot that. They're still used today. From a consistency standpoint, we were able to use the same 10 fields in the beginning. So you have your Ample ID, your Slate ref number, Slate app number, PeopleSoft app number, kind of your standard fields that you would expect to be there. And that allowed for troubleshooting and conversion. At some point, for those of you that went to Slate Summit, they're actually, I think they just released it, but I don't know anybody that's live with it. But they're actually doing the real-time APIs, and there's the touch points and connectors. That is really cool because if for those of you that are liaison schools, they do have that or had that in the past, and so it's really neat to be able to pull any data at any time. So the way that we set this up is, as I mentioned before, it's real time or near real time on the PeopleSoft side. All we have to do is kind of point our hooks on the Slate side, and then we have essentially a near real time back and forth throughout the entire day, and then you're not subject to those windows. Actual component interface errors for those PeopleSoft folks that are on the call here, they're ugly most of the time, and they don't really tell you what's wrong unless you're a developer, or sometimes a developer with your hair on fire and digging and trying to figure out what that is. So what we did was we created a way for smart human-like errors to be represented from those tables. So whatever that big component interface error was, we dumbed it down for us, meaning me and whoever could look at it, to quickly understand what it is that the issue was or what it might be, and that would appear in a report. So we did our error handling where we could change things in Slate, and that was a different model process. I'm gonna let Holger talk about student success.
All right, I think I'm sort of reading through some of the questions in the Q&A. Maybe before we go into student success, I can comment on some of the questions that are here. So one question is about web services, transactional web services. So we use actually transactional web services in two instances. One is as part of the external org integration process with campus services, Boomi makes a call into Slate to see if the record already exists in Slate in the organization data set. What we ran into there is the volume. So I forgot what's the threshold, but there is a limit of transaction per 300-second rolling time frame that you can issue. So what we had to do, we had to change it to just send one query with like 1,000 arguments, and that processed in a few seconds versus sending 1,000 separate inquiries. So yes, web services are possible, but treat them with caution. The other integration we have with web services towards Qualtrics, where we're just finalizing it. We have placement testing and using a Qualtrics survey, and we're building an integration with web services where Qualtrics pulls out the applicant data out of Slate into the survey and then pushes the survey results back into Slate from Qualtrics. So yes, it's possible, but treat it with caution. The other question that was there was related to external orgs. So external orgs, we started with a formal external org process about a year ago, and mainly for reporting purposes. So initially, we got all the external orgs that existed in PeopleSoft together with the PeopleSoft external org ID, and we synced them up with Slate using the SEEP code, which is the org key in Slate. And so then we disabled all the ones that didn't have a match in Slate, and we went through that and did some reconciliation using Slate's internal reconciliation processes, and then we had a pretty good set. And now we have a Boomi integration process that pushes any new sort of verified external org from PeopleSoft to Slate. If an external org doesn't exist in Slate, there's a business process outside any integrations where the admissions offices have to request the external org to be set up in PeopleSoft. And then it will be pushed out via the integration processes to all three campuses.
Yeah, I think just to maybe expand on that, Holger, was that a web service back into Slate?
It's a SFTP file that gets delivered, but we have, because the way the delivered source format in Slate works, we had to determine if it's an insert of a new record or an update. And for that determination, we make a web service call into Slate to figure out if the record already exists or if it's a new record that's going to be added.
Yeah, and then not to get too deep into the weeds, but I think this is something that a lot of you have to deal with, especially at the graduate level or international schools. We did have a piece where we configured unknown internationals for particular countries, not for every country, but for those countries that might be a higher applicant pool. And then that would help with reporting as well as kind of being able to understand where they're coming from and quantify that and pass that off to our Summit data warehouse system.
And maybe one more that I see sort of on top of my head is here a question about STARS and Slate, and that's very relevant to us because we just finished building out that integration. So we are now in cycle 3. So you can see to do this, to really put an effort into streamlining all the onboarding processes and related data, it takes a while. You know, we have a relatively small team, so we can throw unlimited resources to it at the campus level. So we're just chipping away at it. And so we just finished the STARS integration. What we did for STARS is we actually have a Boomi process that merges data from PeopleSoft and from Slate based on a rule set and at what semester we are, what time in the semester. PeopleSoft takes precedence over STARS and vice versa. And we merge that into one demographics file and feed that to STARS. From STARS back, we are getting the contract status, so we can feed that into the onboarding process, trigger communications displayed on the applicant status portal. We have a custom built applicant status portal in Slate, so we can make this look nice. Yeah, so we just finished that.
Okay, so I'm just I'll grab a couple more questions here, just because I think it's within the flow, and then I'm gonna let Holger take on the student success slides. So an example of what you're talking about with your effective dated customization. Some of the schools, again, they didn't all operate the same. Some did plan changes like PLNC rows into the plan change stack on the PeopleSoft side. Others actually went in and did correct history. So it depends on kind of their business process at that particular school. Those that needed to insert a plan change, so there was a change on the application in Slate and they wanted that over before the decision went through or before they matriculated, what we would do is, let's say that came across potentially while they were sitting in suspense, we wouldn't be able to process that particular record for two reasons. One, it didn't have the MPL ID yet because it hasn't been matched. But two, that effective date of that change would be after before the effective date of so if we try to cycle through all those and catch up, that effective date would be before the date that it actually posted. So what we would do is backdate that date and then allow the files to catch up in that order for those ones that are in suspense. Again, the colleges are pretty good about working the suspense files, but hey, Thanksgiving's coming up and we have 3-day weekends and other things that happen. So sometimes it's not just a 24-hour turnaround or whatever it might be. And so we wanted to make sure that we could not, take away or simplify the manual process that were involved there. Let me see here. The Slate configurable API, I think I mentioned that. That's really cool from what I saw at the Slate Summit. And we do want to get our hands on that because that'll allow it to talk to PeopleSoft very fluidly and in a near real-time position. So I'll let Holger talk about student success now, and then we'll come back to some of the questions. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, student success. And before I dive into student success, I want to go back to an earlier point Dan made about different integration options. When we rolled out PeopleSoft roughly 20 years ago, we went from a campus-based SIS to a centralized PeopleSoft, and we had to look at how do we support campus integration. So at an early stage, we started building out a campus staging database for the academic data stack to not always have to go to the central IT department to ask for any new integrations. It just was more flexible for us, more efficient for us to do it this way. There was a little bit pushback on this regarding building shadow systems and whatnot, but I think we've overcome that and we have a fairly established staging database now. Now that staging database is populated from scheduled PeopleSoft queries. We're using those get written out to a server maintained by Central, and then we have actually Linux-based shell scripts that pick up the data via SFTP, process the data, post-process, pre-process, post-process data, so ETL processes, and then load it into the staging database. So when we started student success, we already had a pretty solid integration foundation by just being able to tab into that data in the staging database. We didn't really have to go to back to PeopleSoft to write queries because we had the data. We needed to make a few tweaks here and there, but the foundational data was already at our fingertips to be loaded into Slate. So Slate for student success. As I mentioned earlier, we made the conscientious decision because our recruitment admissions instance between marketing and the 5 admissions areas already very complex to have a separate database, a Slate database, and a completely different data model for Slate for student success. Our recruitment admissions data model pretty much centers around the person record and the application record. In the student success model, we went away from this model. Of course, we're using person records, but we don't use application records. And I'm going to get into this a little bit on the next slide. So we focus, when we started building out Slate, we started meeting with our advisors, and we have a hybrid advising models. We have professional advisors in each college, but we also have faculty advisors. Right now, we are only involving professional advisors, and in the spring next year, we're planning to roll it out slowly to faculty. But we started defining the data model, what the advisors would like to see in Slate, based on the input from the professional advisors. So, and the other decision you also have to consider, and if some of you have been to the Slate Summit and watched presentations about student success, you see one way or the other, or a mixture. Do you build it in the default Slate UI, the admin backend of Slate that you may know, or do you build a custom portal from the get-go? And it's really a philosophical question. In our case, in order to get the advisors an idea on how this may look like, we expose them to the Slate Showcase for Student Success. That's their pre-built demo instance of student success that you can load into your instance. And of course, once the advisors have seen that, they didn't really want to veer too much away from what they've already seen. And so we were kind of then set our path and developing this in the Slate admin UI and using the features available there. The integrations overall are much less complex than recruitment admissions. In our case right now, it's really a one-way street into Slate. We're not pulling much data out of Slate for student success. So we are basically using Slate as a data aggregator. And you may have heard this expression, the 360 view of a student. So we're slowly building that in Slate. So you see here what we're aggregating. We're using data from PeopleSoft Campus Solutions. That's basically the academic stack, the enrollments, term stats, program plan. We pull in data from Salesforce Service Cloud, which is the support cases. We pulling in data from Active Directory to reflect their campus single sign-on account status, and from the OneCard system. Dan, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
So the data model, it leverages, like I said, the person record, but then it really heavily dives into data sets and entities. And for the one that may not know what this means in the Slate context, data sets are really data record objects. Entities define that one-to-many or many-to-many relationship between data sets and the person record. At this stage, we do not use the application records at all. There are some institutions that may use it to differentiate by standing year, but our advisors didn't feel that's necessary at this stage, so we left it completely out using the application records, and we just focus on the person records and then custom data sets. So like I mentioned before, we use custom data sets for the PeopleSoft, the terms, the program plans, all the PeopleSoft academic configuration data, basically. We also loading faculty and staff into a custom data set. The person record only contains students. This way we can keep it delineated and structure it much better. Then entities is obviously the data sets that define, join the students to the terms and courses to instructors and so on, enrollment, support case, advising notes, those are all entities. Advising note is not to mix up with PeopleSoft advising notes. We do not bring any advising notes over from PeopleSoft. We built this out completely in Slate. Now, the person status, for the ones that are familiar with Slate, when you process applications in Slate, you have specific statuses that reflect on the person status. You can customize them, but Slate usually hinges around them for a lot of things, from workflow, reader bins, and whatnot. In student success, we decided to get rid of them, and instead we're doing in our staging database a roll-up calculation. You see sort of the screenshot here, the typical program plan statuses that you see in PeopleSoft, we're reflecting out, and we have some priority logic on saying, okay, if some student has multiple program stacks, let's say they're graduated and they have an active program stack, the overall person status is active in program. The completed program will still show there, but the priority status is active in program. So we have some logic around there how to prioritize that.
Yeah, remember here we're talking more about the student record side of PeopleSoft and the advisement side. So
correct.
Program plan stack and passing that back. So for those of you that are admissions folks, you're probably familiar somewhat with that. And those of you folks that work in the registrar's office, you're intimately familiar with dealing with the program plan stack on both sides, you know, as it gets passed across to you.
Yeah, so the next few slides just give you an idea of how this shows in people's in Slate. And one of the things you notice is that it gives the advisor a much more aggregate designed overview of the data. You know, when you're with PeopleSoft, you have a lot of different screens, a lot of information on different places. Here we were able to design this in a way that it gives the advisor the information they need at their fingertips in an easy to find way. We also made some tweaks to Slate. You can see there's a student picture normally where my picture shows, but I didn't want to show any student pictures. I just put in mine. But we moved some things around with like JavaScript, HTML to make it look a little differently. But other than that, if you've seen the showcase, you recognize how this is all laid out. It's not that much differently. But then you can see all this data that populates here is PeopleSoft data, with the exception of the login status and the last LMS login that comes from the LMS
Holger,
system, from our planning system.
Yeah, Holger, I think what would be great is for you just to describe how you get the information out of PeopleSoft into this screen, right?
Oh, yeah. So basically, I mentioned earlier, we have the staging database. So we run PeopleSoft query. For example, we have a query for student academic program plans. We run the query that gets dumped onto an SFTP server. A shell script right now picks it up, moves it to our staging database. Ultimately, this is slated to go to Boomi too, but we're not quite there yet. Then from the staging database, a Boomi process picks it up. So we built export views specific for Slate in our staging database. A Boomi process queries that staging database and then moves it to Slate SFTP. In Slate, we have a source format. So in this case, academic program plans is between a data set that just stores all active available program plans, and then an entity that associates the student with their current program plan status with a program plan. So we load two different data sets for program plan. We load the records, the program plan records from PeopleSoft on a daily basis, and then we load the student program plan data on a daily basis. And yeah, that happens via Boomi and SFTP on the Slate side, and then Slate picks it up via the source format and loads it into Slate.
Awesome, thanks.
And then, so if you go forward, then the next slide is advising notes. So this, like I mentioned before, this is a custom-built functionality in Slate, which is easy to do. You can build forms in Slate. It's an entity record. So it's sort of also like a custom object in Slate. You have a lot of flexibility there to define it. We did some little tweaks with JavaScript to make it searchable. And then the button just links out to the advising note form. Next one. So here, this is the support cases. These are all from Salesforce. And if you look at the left column, we actually have different type of support cases in Salesforce. Our student service center uses Salesforce, so there are student service cases, and then my IT department, we use Salesforce Service Cloud, so they're IT support cases, and then we just bring them over. Right now, it's a little bit difficult to determine if cases have been resolved and how they have been resolved, so we're working on making that better, distinguishing the description in the case from the resolution of the case, so we can actually give the advisor that information. Okay, what's the case about and how was it resolved in a more deliberate way than just having a description. Next one. Then enrollments, and here you really see the advantage of Slate for the advisor. It puts really the enrollments in a nice context. So we structured it by past courses at the bottom, then current courses in the middle, and if they're already enrolled for the next semester, it shows future courses. You can click on one of these and it will give you some more details that just didn't fit in here, and the advisors didn't think it would be necessary to see it at one glance, but we have more information there. I don't have a screenshot for that. It just gives a pop-up where you can add as many data elements about this enrollment as you want to. Next one. Yeah, the last one is, I skipped transfer AP credit. We're also bringing out the transfer AP credits from PeopleSoft, and it's a similar display as enrollments. It just shows the transfer AP courses. And then we made one screen for the program plans and then for the term stats. And again, the same thing here. This is sort of what the advisors wanted to see at a glance. There's more data behind it where they can click on each of these records and see more data elements then. And that's pretty much about student success.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Holger. I'm going to go through a couple of slides and then we'll come back and answer some more of the questions and answers, since I think we have about 10 minutes here. Again, I mentioned the training piece that is coming out as far as PeopleSoft training. We are the premier on-prem training partner. And so please reach out if you need training. If you see this QR code, you can kind of scan that into your phone right now, hold it up to the screen or wherever you're sitting and pull that down. And that'll take you to a small form to fill out, and we can contact you about particular training. We did some pretty cool custom stuff like last year for the Wisconsin system. We did a pretty big long training, but we're also doing different webinars and packages and pieces that come out as part of our all access learning pass. So that's an annual subscription. I think it would be great to kind of see everybody get involved there as well. And we're bringing some of the best teachers that you've seen through this Hug platform for many, many years, friends of ours, and probably some of them are on here. I see a couple of them, which is fantastic, as well as others. So I'd love to help you guys out from that respect as well. And if you have any ideas, suggestions, anything like that, feel free to send those along too. We're going to add to that collection as well, just to make that the best it could be for you guys. As far as the Slate side of the house, if you're looking to kind of understand or maybe ramp up where you're at in your Slate process, we have a health check. If you could, again, it's another QR code to fill out the form for the Slate health check. This is where you get 8 eyeballs on your system. They'll log in and review everything that you have, find out what you're not using, maybe some best practices that you're missing out on or functionality, and then produce an executive summary and a roadmap for your school to use going forward. Just to reiterate, we are a premier Hug sponsor, and I think we're doing the keynote again this year. I might be wrong if Susan wants to jump in, but either way, we're there. We have a big presence, so come see us. I will definitely be there, and I love to see you guys always on that kind of stuff. Let's go back to the questions, and I'm just going to look at the box here as far as what's out there. Anything that I can't answer, I will answer. And then anything else I'll come back to. So if you're passing application data into CS as soon as the application is complete, what are you doing to make the data available to financial aid for modeling purposes, but keep it hidden from other campus stakeholders while the class is being shaped? This really is a tough question to answer because it depends on what your FA policy is and how you're doing things. I've seen some schools basically reach into that data. I mean, you can do it from a prospect, you can do it just from the ICER load. So there's different settings from that perspective, but also it depends on when you want to put that information into your system. So if it's an out of the box type of question, it depends on how you've configured it for me to answer that. If you could, maybe just, I think Susan will have your contact information. I don't mind taking that one offline and digging a little bit deeper into your particular situation. Yao, Banzu, you got a lot of questions here. That's awesome. Love it. Is it possible to use the delivered staging tables and separate by transaction ID? We do use the delivered staging tables. What I meant by those other custom staging tables, that's really for tracking the transaction. So we take timestamps, we take the file name, we take the Boomi execution ID and all of these various fields. When you actually create the staging tables that you see in CTM, which is Constituent Transaction Manager, we do use those. So we are posting from there via the web service. So that's all real time. We send the create, save, submit transaction the same way that you would as well. But in those transactions, we're logging to other staging tables. So we definitely still use it. And we update our staging table with the SEC temp ID as it gets created. So we have all of that information in there. Did I understand correctly that your integration between Slate and PeopleSoft is leveraging AAWS? When I look at service operations related, I don't see the ability to update existing applications, only create. All right, so there actually is, and we don't use it, but there actually is a Git application. We actually take it through all the way through submit. And once you do submit, you can no longer update that application. So your understanding there, Perry, is correct. It will stop you from updating at that point, which is typically a good thing. The way that AA, and I don't want to dive too much into this, but the way that AAWS was originally designed was for if you built a custom app in like a Java or something, .NET or whatever. And so a applicant could come back to that custom app, fill some things out, come back again, fill some things out, come back again, fill some things out. And then when they were ready, they would submit it. So that was kind of the basis of that design. And again, that's, wow, almost 13, 14, 15, 14 years ago. I'm getting old. So yeah, there are some implications there. If you haven't used the web services, it's documented pretty well. That was one of the things that there's a data catalog for AWS as well as the delivered services. You just need to get those up and running. You bring the completed application data in, this is an anonymous, into CS. How do you update the data in CS from Slate if a student updated his or her biodemo data such as addresses after the initial load? Okay, good question. This is where your school has to determine, and this is a big exercise in the beginning of your planning stages, what is going to be the system of record and when. What does that look like? Some schools don't pass any information back after it's gotten into PeopleSoft. Some schools pass everything back and vice versa. There may be multiple transactions. Also, others may say at a point in time, we're going to draw a line in the sand, whether that be at matriculation, at the census date, whatever determination is made by your business side of the house to decide when that is. So it is difficult, and the answer is a little different depending on what the decision is as far as those updates, because you need to start looking at when something was updated from a timestamp perspective, and it can get very complex.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because keep in mind, we are a shared campus solution instance. So the biodemo record is shared essentially across 3 campuses. And there's a lot of conversation about this. Now, for our campus, and this may not be in agreement with the other 2 campuses, our records are excluded from the query when we set we have a term prompt when we set this term prompt to inactive. We are not quite managing it via rounds and whatnot and periods because of some of the alignment issues between the different admissions offices. So we are using a prompt that populates the application form, and once we deactivate the term prompt, then that shuts off the record from all the PeopleSoft queries. Now, in some cases, that could be well into the fall semester because our continuing ed has short sessions that start mid-semester in the fall, so they may want to keep it going. So it's maybe not in sync 100% with what the other campuses are doing, but that's how we are handling that.
Cool. Thanks, Holger. We only have a couple minutes left. So one thing that I'd like to do is just, number one, thank everybody for joining. I didn't know if we'd have 10 folks or 20 or 50 or whatever, but having over 150 was pretty awesome. And to look and see that we still have 125 here at this time, that's pretty cool. So we appreciate that. We'll definitely do some more of these, probably not before the end of the year, but we do have some trainings coming up as well. So please join those. And it's specific to different modules. But we'll also do some more webinars like this, because I think it's very helpful for the community. And I'm glad and appreciate Hug allowing us to partner with them on this and being able to kind of share that information. I've used the Hug for 20 years, or it's just forever. And so I've been at so many of the conferences, and I really enjoy it. Casey?
Yeah, thank you. As we wrap up, I just want to say thank you, everybody. The Hub would like to thank both of our presenters today for putting on a great webinar. Again, the recordings and slides will soon be available in the eAcademy on-demand files. While you're there, make sure to check out the upcoming webinars like Dan was talking about, and events page. There's a survey at the end of this webinar that if you have a moment, we'd love if you could fill it out. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.